Greetings. Welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu, aka Rayon. So, in this week's episode, our focus will be on adoption, especially within the U.S. foster care or adoptive system. Now, let's start with some basics. And of course, there are three ways to get into a family. One way is through birth, that is, a child is born into a family. And the families, of course, are the most essential and most fundamental building blocks of a community, a society, of whatever scale and size and grandeur that may be. And so families, of course, are this nucleus, right? This very crucial hub for allowing us to essentially become human beings and to remain so, depending upon our particular purpose or purposes that we have in this human experience and lifetime. And the second way in which we get into a family is through marriage. That is, marriage connects at least two families. It consummates the union between those formerly two individuals. And in fact, most marriages, particularly within various African societies and of the world, really, are consummated by birth between the married couple. And so marriage is the second way in which we get into a family. The third way we get into a family is through adoption. And there are various ways to adopt. There is formal adoption, that is going through the paperwork and the bureaucracy of either a foster care system adopting agency or any local or state government office that deals with adoption. And so in those three ways, birth, marriage, adoption, today we're going to focus on the latter, which is adoption, as one way to either enlarge or create a family. And again, I want to emphasize family because that is the hub, that is the context in which human life occurs. In other words, none of us, though we may believe this, come into this earth alone. We're born into a family, a part of a family. However, our feelings may be about members of that family, that is really moot. The fact that we're born into a family and we come through a mother, or at least a carrier, into this world is the fact in which we want to pin for this discussion. So let's get into adoption, particularly within the context of the U.S. foster and adoptive care system, but not solely, because over the world, most of the processes for adoption are similar, even though international adoptions require a little more paperwork, a little more scrutiny, and as it should, because we're transferring a child from one country, one context, one cultural context, and political environment into another. And so, given the presence of smuggling, of stealing, and in some cases outright abusing and exploiting young children through trafficking all over the world, there's good reason, of course, to have some scrutiny when it comes to adoption, at least international adoption. Now, we'll focus on domestic form because that's probably most relevant to some of you that may be considered, if not looking into adopting a child, depending upon where you are in age, your family status, and your desires to have a child or to have children or more children, depending upon your situation. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the adoption in terms of how these processes tend to work. And of course, I won't get into the fine detail because, of course, that's between you and the agencies and whoever is representing you in this process. But the short story is that there are many ways to adopt. So there's the formal adoption, which I mentioned a moment ago, and I'll explore that first, and I'll get into the informal ways to adopt. So the formal ways of adoption include, especially this in case for peoples of African ancestry, the formal ways to adopt, of course, is to go through an agency, adoptive agency. And of course, there are many of them throughout the country. In fact, each city, each municipality and county will have an agency or an office that deals with adoption. That is the formal process of declaring your intentions, going through an agency, and going to, for example, a foster care home or a facility that houses children who have been put up for adoption. Now, the formal way, of course, can be very arduous. They can be very scrutinous in terms of verifying and assuring that you, the adopted potential parent, has the environment, that is the housing situation, has the financial resources, and of course, has some of the intangible, sort of the care that will nurture and allow for the bonds between the adoptive child or children and the adopting parent or parents. Now, it's harder to measure the qualities of a person because anyone can essentially pretend, and many of these people, have done this, pretend to be caring individuals for the purpose of adopting, because there is, and I want to share with you the reality, there is the use of adoption for making money. That is, there are people who will adopt children for the purpose of getting a paycheck from the local government or the agencies thereof. And that is a fact, right? So I want those who are looking to adopt and is in fact maybe in the process of adopting to think about that scrutiny is also because of the fact of people using children as transactional tools or transactional means for financial gain and financial ends, and they have no care or desire to care for and protect the children that are under their care. That said, this is part of the scrutiny that has to be there. There are agencies that are also careless. And so you, the potential parent, has to be aware and do your due diligence as to the quality and the reputation of the adopting agency, especially if it's not a non-governmental agency that is in fact used in the adoption process. Even the local government ones want us to also make sure you're on top of your game and do your homework and, ask very serious and tough questions or ongoing questions and be very scrutinizing, because it is a child you're adopting. It's not a toy that you're buying. It's not a thing that you're purchasing from the store that you're taking home from the mall. That it is a human being that's a part of this transaction, if you will. And so the formal way, of course, includes, filling out an application, being interviewed, and of course, at some point, once you're deemed to be an appropriate, potential parent, adoptive parent, then of course you will visit one of the homes or facilities that will actually have these children or child there. Now, there are informal ways, particularly for African peoples, and many of you African-descended peoples included will know this from either your own experience or having experience of friends and people in your community who have done this, whereby it is quite common for an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent to actually take on and adopt a child without going through the formal process, meaning they will actually care and rear the child as they would their own without going through the bureaucracy and the paperwork. Now, that process, of course, can be seamless, but can be troublesome. It can be seamless if the parties that are involved are, in fact, on the same page. For example, let's say the parents transition and there is no will, there is no document stating what they want for the child or children. The family members will decide then, how to best care for the children and take care of them. There's also cases whereby a parent or parent with a single parent may be alive, but won't let them do with the child or is unable to care for the child. An aunt or a grandmother or grandfather or some family member will say, hey, I will have the child live with me. And that's usually the code word, live with me, and take care of the child as if it were their own, for either a moment of time or for the period in which that child becomes a legal adult. And so there are very much informal ways in which people of African ancestry in the United States and of course, in other parts of the world still happens today. I have friends, for example, who are in West Africa who will, when a parent passed away, they'll not only adopt the child, but adopt the mother of the child if the parent, in fact, was the male, and vice versa, whereby if the mother transitions or the mother, let's say, is incapacitated, whether it's and it could happen for both parents. So whether either parent is incapacitated by a mental illness or a physical disablement, other members of the family will step up and will adopt the child, take the child in and care for them as if it were their own. And so these kinship mechanisms do exist and still exist within Africa, and of course within the broader worldwide African diasporas. And so there is these informal ways in which to be done. Now, there can be pitfalls whereby, let's say, members of the family who are concerned are not on the same page. Remember, there are tensions, there are unresolved conflicts, and the children will be used as pawns in these conflicts. That's something that you, as a protective or prospective parent, has to be aware of and try to navigate it best you can if you go the informal route. And in fact, one may have maybe a combination of both the informal route and the formal route, meaning one may actually try to negotiate within the structure of one's family and within the dynamics of your family, because you know the dynamics better than I do, to figure out ways in which to at least negotiate something that can be then formalized in terms of formal adoption, right? So there's a way in which one can combine both processes depending upon the status of the birth parent or the birth parents. Now, all that said, there are other sort of cultural and political concerns. One concern, I'm sure, questions that prospective parents of African ancestry have about the adoption of children of African ancestry, especially, is that what happens or how do people feel when non-African descended peoples adopt African descended children, right? And that concern is not simply one out of a certain kind of envy or jealousy, or that other people, in quotations, cannot adopt African children. It is a real concern in the sense of there are clear cultural, historical, as well as political concerns about those kinds of transactions, meaning there is a long and very strong history, living history of racial capitalism, racialized slavery, and the marketing and auctioning and selling of African children, period. And we can't escape, leapfrog, or pretend that history does not exist as a living history. And so there is that real concern that, for example, there's a concern that, well, white folks should not adopt children of African ancestry. That's also a political concern because of the history that people of African ancestry have, and that's a real valid concern. It's not simply an ideological or a sociological issue. It's a real concern that people have and should have, because we live in history. History is a living, breathing thing. It's not simply something in a museum or a relic to say, hey, that's nice and that's cute. It's a living history, and so that is a concern. Those are concerns about people that are wealthy, that essentially will buy children internationally and have them, for example, in their basements or in a closet, using them to cook, clean, and wash. And so there are all these real concerns that should be had by people about the adoption, generally speaking, of children of African ancestry. There are other kinds of concerns too, which is there are, again, these cultural concerns, which even parents I know who are of non-African ancestry, adopt children of African ancestry, they worry and concern about the cultural synchronization between themselves and the children, wanting to provide a cultural and appropriate context, putting love and care aside, which of course are important, but they're not the end-all and be-all of the bonds between a child or children and adults. And so those are real concerns that one may have. And so, but those concerns also concern people of African ancestry. So for example, let's say a family from the Caribbean basin wants to, adopt a child, from West Africa, or let's say folks from Georgia or North Carolina want to adopt, a child from Antigua or Jamaica or Barbados. There are similar, but not the same degree of cultural and political concerns. In other words, some of those things could still be there to make sure the child has an environment that, in fact, they can streamline into and, of course, receive the love, care, and concern that they deserve. Now, again, the degrees are different, but there is still that specter, of concern. Other concerns that may come up within the adoptive process is the ultimate goal of adoption, meaning why adopt in the first place, right? it is either to enlarge or to have a family. And so there, for example, single adults, both male and female, who are thinking about ways to have or enlarge a family. So then the goal is that this is a lifetime agreement. It's not simply an agreement or a contract until the child is 18, and then of course they move on their way. And so if that goal in mind, what do we do then when we think about the overarching goal for the child and the family? Well, the overarching goals, I think should include at least three factors. One, to ensure that that child is integrated into the broader family. So the adult who is adopting has to think about the brothers and sisters and siblings of that adoptive parent, if they have any, the aunts and uncles and the grandparents, how to in fact, bring those people on board, and of course integrate the child into that broader web of community of people. That will take time, that will be a process, but that has to be a consideration in the mind and in the planning of the adopted parent. Second factor to consider, all the financial resources, the kind of schooling, public or private or homeschooling, the resources that be required. What is the health history and medical history of the child? There may be some issues there. I don't say issues, but there may be some health challenges, whether they be psychological, because of course the fact that a child is in foster care or is in adoptive system suggests that there is some trauma, right? And so there has to be that sensibility, okay, I need to be prepared as the potential parent, what kinds of health, mental health, physical and social health resources I need to bring to bear to bring that child in streamlined to be integrated within the family. And third and final, factor is, of course, sort of the broader arc, of the life one has to think about, which is when that child becomes adult, how that child thinks about themselves, and the relationship with the adopted parent, and concerns about, and this will happen, concerns about from that child or children, what became of my birth parents or birth parent. And I say parent because, of course, it's possible nowadays, to, various medical means to conceive a child by yourself and to bring the child full term and to have that child, as it were, as a single parent. So those are three very important factors, three very important considerations in this process. And I'll tell you, as one who has been through the foster care system, I was never adopted, but I went to live with an aunt, for some years. So I've been through this system. Like probably next video, another video, I can talk to you about the foster care system if you're interested in that. But I can tell you from experience, of that process, being on the other side, potentially being adopted, that this, in fact, is a very serious and important matter. And in closing, I would say that there are a lot of children who are looking for caring, devoted, and loving potential parents there. And so if adoption is a possibility for you, do consider it, and consider it wholeheartedly, and consider it fully within the factors I've laid out, within the discussion I've laid out. And of course, there's more to this, but at least within that context as a starting point. And then, of course, do your due diligence and follow your head and your heart in combination. And if both are aligned, go for it. For Papa Nyame, I've been your guide and host for another episode of Papa Nyame. Hope to see you next time. Until then, stay well.